Um, I don't know. Can I do a green screen? I think I can, right? I think
Yeah, I
it'd
can
be
make you
helpful.
expand it as well.
It might be too small though. Okay, you can't really see. I'm just gonna keep it there, even though you can't really
No, I
see.
got you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'm just gonna read it out. It's a deductive argument. Premise one, there is testimony saying that Jesus was resurrected. Premise two, this testimony comes from credible sources. Premise three, there is only three logical possibilities with respect to credible testimony. It is true, it is deliberately false, or it is honestly mistaken. Premise four, the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is not deliberately false. Premise five, the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is not honestly mistaken. Premise six, therefore, the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is true. Premise seven, if the credible testimony for the resurrection of Jesus is true, then Jesus was resurrected. Premise eight, therefore, Jesus was resurrected. Premise nine, if Jesus was resurrected, then the God he revealed very probably exists. Premise 10, therefore, the God Jesus revealed very probably exists.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to screenshot that, brother, and be able to pull it up so I could follow you here. Do you mind hopping out of the way just a second so I could take a screen? Just so I have that, so I don't so I don't lose you here. Sorry, go ahead and continue, man. I don't mean to interrupt your opening statement.
I don't take the most controversial premises to be two. I take the most controversial premises to be 2, 4, and 5. So I'll spend most of my time defending them. Now I'll briefly touch on premise 9. To be clear, there's simply not enough time to dive into all the evidence and the nuance. For example, my paper on why I'm a Christian is 32 pages, but I can still give some strong reasons to believe they are true. So let's begin in order, starting with the second premise, that this testimony comes from credible sources. I define a credible source as a source from someone in a good position to know what actually happened, like by witnessing it directly or hearing about it directly from someone who did. The central sources are the writings of Paul, in particular 1 Corinthians, and the Gospels. Paul's authorship is rarely disputed, contrary to the Gospels, but we have good evidence for the traditional authorship. I will quickly go through it. Firstly, there are no anonymous copies of the four Gospels, and early Christians would have needed a reason to accept them and a way to differentiate them. Many people object that they do not identify themselves in the text, but this is true of many ancient historians like Tacitus and Plutarch. Secondly, there are strong and consistent external attestations of the traditional authors early on. This is stated universally with a geographical spread. This is in stark contrast to a truly anonymous book like the book of Hebrews. Thirdly, Mark and Luke weren't eyewitnesses or prominent in the early church, so it wouldn't make sense to invent them as authors unless there were good historical reason, like they actually were. Fourthly, the documents contain data consistent with the traditional authors. For example, Matthew, a tax collector, is focused on money. Mark, a disciple of Peter, emphasized Jewish custom and Peter. Luke, a doctor, was trained in physician terms, and John showed knowledge of Palestinian geography. And there's a lot more textbooky evidences I could go through to attest to the reliability. I'll go through them quickly as well. Firstly, Luke's approach to historical reportage is similar to other ancient historians like Thucydides and Josephus, and he also uses language suggesting an insider's perspective and authority like Demosthenes. I'm having trouble pronouncing these ancient names. Also in Acts, he uses the word we, suggesting personal involvement in events described. Secondly, historian Colin Himmer wrote a book that details 84 factual confirmations in the book of Acts. Just one example is a precise term for taking soundings and correct depth of water near Malta in Acts 27. Thirdly, the knowledge of personal names is congruent with the time and place, known as in scholarship as onomastic congruence. For comparison, the Gospel of Judas, a late Gnostic gospel, has significant disparity. The contrast shows the reliability of the text. Lastly, I will just list more reasons we can further discuss if Dean wants to. The Gospels are biographies. Everybody historically understood them to be historical accounts. They contain embarrassing information. They contain historically oriented fulfillment of prophecy. They contain undesired coincidences, and they leave out non-historical information. Woo! All right. I know that was a fire hose of information, but that's the reality of the evidence for the reliability of the Gospels. Thus, there are three logical possibilities. They were lying, mistaken, or telling the truth. Let's move on to the next controversial premise. It's deliberately false. I will give two main reasons against this. First, it seems that they had nothing to gain by lying. There's no obvious benefit to be gained by deliberately misleading people into believing that Jesus had been resurrected. Secondly, there was every reason not to lie about something like this. We know that early Christians faced intense persecution at the hands of the Romans. Paul describes that himself in his letters. Church history records that Paul, Matthew, and Mark were martyred. Generally speaking, one of the strongest human instincts is self-preservation. If the disciples really believe that Jesus was resurrected and that this ensured them eternal life, then their willingness to die for this belief is easy to explain. Next, if they aren't lying, then the next premise, perhaps they are mistaken. Dean can present a more detailed account if you like, and we can touch on that, but I'm going to attack the most popular class of explanations, that they are purely psychological factors. Firstly, it lacks an explanation of the empty tomb. They're at least genuinely believing their own reports. This means we would have to accept their witness to the fact that Jesus' tomb was really empty. This physical evidence can't be explained by a purely psychological hypothesis. Secondly, it would be an instance where everything we know about hallucinations would be contradicted, with individuals experiencing the same exceptionally rare polymodal hallucination over 40 days despite lacking anticipation of Jesus' resurrection. So it follows that the testimony is true. So Jesus rose. Ooh, that's hope. That's awesome. This provides the best explanation of the voluntary suffering appearances of Jesus, women at the tomb, empty tomb, and immediate proclamation. I'm almost done. I know I'm speaking quickly. To briefly defend premise 9, that is, if Jesus was resurrected, then the God he revealed very probably exists. The justification comes from the context surrounding the life and ministry of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus occurs in fulfillment of his prediction that this was the one sign that he was from God. It functions as a vindication of his divine claims. That event, paired with a religious context, which includes a prediction of said resurrection as a sign of divine approval, warrants an inference to God action as the best explanation of said resurrection. Dean needs to propose a better explanation if he wants to deny this. I'd like to see him try. And even on top of that, there are good arguments for the existence of God, more generally, and arguments that this leads to predictions about an incarnation, resurrection, and atonement. See Richard Swinburne, a good philosopher. But I won't even get into that because I think the case I presented today in this opening statement is sufficient. So to wrap up, I remind you all of the type of argument I presented. It's a deductive argument. So that means if the premises are true, then the conclusion logically and inescapably follows regardless of how Dean feels. So Dean will need to show one of the premises to be false. If or when he fails to do that, you will know who won this debate. Now then, all right, Dean, let's hear it.
All right, Dean, on to you. You can start your opening statement. You can go for it. You can have your time. I don't think it's going to take very long, but go for it, man.
Perfect. So according to the Christian faith, God is a loving being that cares about us, but there are some people that are not cared about. I look at this world and I don't think that this is what we would expect if there was to be a being that existed without limitations that genuinely cared for us. For example, we have standards for parents. How do we know if we have a good parent or a bad parent? We look at how the child is treated. If the child is being starved, beaten, suffering from an illness that is curable, why would we say that that parent is good? In fact, we would probably say that parent is bad. Why wouldn't we have similar expectations for a God? If we would look at the child to determine if the parent is good, why wouldn't we look at creation to determine if the creator is good? We see horrible atrocities all throughout history. We often talk about the Holocaust. Excuse me. But there is other related atrocities that I bet you've never heard of. Like in World War II, nearly 200,000 non-Jewish Polish children were abducted from their homes merely because they looked German. And then they were turned into slaves, and they had medical experimentations ran on them, and the children labeled as racially valuable were forcefully assimilated into SS centers, re-educated, and then forcefully adopted out into German households. Those that did not have blonde hair and blue eyes were sent to Auschwitz to be starved, brutalized, and unalived. The parents of the abducted kids resisted their children being taken by the Nazis. Militias formed, mothers and fathers lost their own lives in attempts to protect the lives of their little ones. And what did God do? Let me ask you all this hypothetical question. If one of the parents had just simply allowed the SS soldiers to take their children, enslave their children, and run medical experiments on their children, even if it could be easily prevented, would we say that that is a good parent? I believe that everyone listening, including yourself, Brooks, would say no. And I'm not a Christian because I'm compelled to say the same thing about God. One might say that God did not intervene as this would forsake the free will of the Nazi soldiers. But what about the free will of the children? God could have either intervened and infringed upon the free will of the Nazi soldiers, or allowed them to continue, which led to them infringing upon the free will of one of the innocent children, turning them into slaves and test subjects for medical experimentation and so on. So whose free will do we value more? Whose free will should we value more, the Nazis or the victims of the Nazis? If Jesus was walking on the ground while those 200,000 children were being abducted, what would Jesus do? Would he join arms with the powerless Polish men and women attempting to prevent the SS soldiers from stealing the children that inevitably lost their lives in doing so? Or would the Nazi soldiers be ever so satisfied with Jesus sitting back and simply allowing these things to occur with God in complacency? More importantly, is free will even of concern? Can the free will of man thwart the plan and or the intention of God? Not according to Scripture. For prophet Isaiah said, "The Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have designed, so it shall be, and as I have planned, so it shall come to pass." Does this mean that God had planned the abduction of the 200,000 children, or their enslavement, brutalization, starvation, and deaths? Would you say that it is possible that God had good reason to allow for these things? Look, even if Jesus resurrected doesn't mean that he's a good God. I don't know what happened 2,000 years ago, but this doesn't get God off the hook for what happened to the Polish children. And if anything, when we're talking about premise 9 of your argument, the probability of Jesus' resurrection indicating that the Christian God exists, I think that there is some very large issues with the reconciling of the evil and suffering that exists in the world and what this would tell us about the special relationship that God has to the world.
All right, seems like we're done with the opening statements, everyone. We're going to move on to open discussion. I'm only going to step in on the basis of people like overcutting people off, right? So I'm going to give it off to everyone. You guys can start wherever you guys would like. Go for it.
Yeah, so I'm curious, you said with premise 9, you questioned the probability of that statement. So is your only argument kind of this problem, the evil question?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the problem of evil, specifically the one that I'd posit, I think that there was some necessary concessions that you would have to make about the world around us in order for it to be congruent with a God, right? Especially a God that is all good.
Why should I think that?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and I'll go ahead and detail that issue to you. So I think, like, first of all, we must understand what exactly you take evil to be. I take evil to be something that shouldn't occur. Would you agree or disagree with this?
Why should I believe that?
Well, because that's how we understand bad things in normative ethics.
No, I don't think that's a good consensus. Like, for example, when we talk about like deontological ethics or utilitarian ethics, it's good or evil is determined based on if you're acting in accordance with your moral duty or acting that leads to more flourishing or more pleasure. And that's how we would define a good or bad.
Well, that's the deontological, sorry. So those are like the specific normative frameworks. So we could have different ways to determine what should or shouldn't occur. Like, for instance, a utilitarian might say what should occur is what maximizes the utility for all. While a deontic might say what should occur is the minimization of rights violations. But all things considered, right, normativity is just talking about oughts and ought nots. Sorry. So if something is good, it means it should happen, and something is bad if it shouldn't happen. So I just simply ask you in return, if you disagree with this idea, can you please give me an example of something that's good that shouldn't happen?
Well, do you think there's normativity that are not moral matters?
No.
For example, I ought to speak according to the rules of English grammar. Do you think that's a moral good?
So I think that there's different types of ought claims, but ought claims that pertain to normativity is specifically in the context of morality. Because an ought claim is just the evaluation.
That sounds redundant. You said ought claims that.
So there's moral oughts and non-moral oughts.
Ought claims that pertain to normativity.
Yeah, so there's like moral oughts and there's non-moral oughts, like epistemic oughts. Because all that an ought is the evaluation of a success-failure relationship. So if I make like a good move in chess, right, well then that is just the success of a success-failure relationship. It's like what I should do in accordance with my own values and preferences. But specifically when we're talking about God, you'd say that God's values and God's preferences and his will as a whole is literally the grounding for what is good. If God has a preference for something, it is good by virtue of God's preference. But see, the same thing can't be said about me. So yes, all of God's preferences would pertain to like moral ought claims. Meanwhile, mine not necessarily.
Okay,
I'll just simply ask you: would you agree that it's okay to say something is good if it should happen and something is bad if it shouldn't?
I'm not gonna answer like what my psychological position is. I'm asking you why I should think that. So when you say that good is what ought be done, it seems you're changing the definition. You think good is what morally ought to be done, but that seems circular.
Wait, we're talking about like moral ought claims. So if something is good, it means that it should be done in this like non-epistemic sense.
Okay, how do you define good?
So it's an internal critique. So this would be operating off of your notion of goodness.
And you're assuming that it's ought to be done, yeah, right?
Well, like regardless of what your specific normative framework is, at the end of the day, it will still just tell us what should be done. Like I'll just simply ask you, can you name something that is good that shouldn't be done?
Okay, for example, I'll bite even though I think there's some things I can push on. In philosophy, there's like scenarios called Sophie's choice. And so this originally comes from a book or a movie. I'm actually not too familiar in the history, but basically the idea is that suppose that there are logically exhaustive options of two cases of evil. Okay, and let's say in one instance it's lesser evil. So either you ought to either kill someone or kill 5 people. Okay, I think in this case you ought to kill one person. Does
Yeah,
it
you say
follow
you
that?
should kill one person instead of the 5.
Hey, listen, you ought to kill one person. Does that mean killing one person is good in this case?
Well, if like if you're running like utilitarianism, you'd say it's good, all things considered,
Well, I thought it
because
was
the
about
opposite
normative
is 5.
frameworks. I thought it wasn't about normative frameworks.
Well, I have to imply normative framework in order to answer if it's good.
Then how do you expect me to answer the question if your blanket statement is that what good is what ought to be done?
Well, regardless of what your normative framework is, that's just what it tells us. So, like, for example, so like without like telling like me why it ought to be done, at the end of the day, it's still something that you think should occur. Like, for instance, you think people should or shouldn't sin
I think people should not sin.
because it's bad to sin, right? So bad
so
things tell us what shouldn't
That
occur.
doesn't prove that they're identical. That
So
they
would you
mean-
be okay? So I want you to go ahead and give me an instance of something that would fall outside of this case, right?
I just gave you.
So
I'll give you another example.
So name something that is good that shouldn't happen. Like because all if you say like let me touch on your specific example because you gave me
let's let Brooks respond real quick.
Real quick, I'll give you an example. You asked me a question. Okay. So I can flip it. Let's say this. I think it is so good. I think it is so good to give up your life, become a doctor, go to the middle of nowhere. It is so good to do that. But I also think it's good to become a firefighter, just like live very modestly, donate all your money. Would you say in both cases you ought to? It seems like a contradiction because
those are epistemic ought claims when we're particularly
those are
talking about
epistemic ought claims.
yeah, when we're talking about like
What about that was epistemic?
yeah, they're good because they're in accordance with your preference. For instance, if I don't have a preference for becoming a firefighter, then it wouldn't be good in this practical sense for me to become a firefighter.
What are you talking about? Okay, when I say it's good, this is not an epistemic claim. When I say
So you're talking about moral claims.
go ahead. When you say epistemic ought, what does that mean?
So it's just like in accordance with my preference or some type of success-failure relationship is present. Like for instance, if I'm playing chess with a friend, like I should like checkmate their king, right? But when I'm saying that I should checkmate their king, I'm not saying that it would be morally good for me to checkmate their king, right? These ought claims are pertaining to knowledge, like what you should believe, right?
Do you
But
think I made
I do just want to clear this up, right? I do just want to clear this up. So when we are talking about like these shouldn't claims only in the context of morality, right? There's other shouldn't claims that don't pertain to morality. When we're talking about the problem of evil, we're only talking about morality. And I just want to agree on a conceptual basis with you. So if something is good, it means it should happen, right? In this moral sense. If something is bad, it means it shouldn't happen in a moral sense. So I'll just simply ask you if you agree or disagree with me. Because if you disagree with
think
me,
that's
I'll
irrelevant.
ask you to not red herring me by bringing up these other senses of shoulds
Red
and
herring.
shouldn'ts.
You're the one that asked me the questions. What do you mean red herring? Okay, I'll answer the question again. When I say that, you said give me an example that's good, but you ought not do it. And so I gave you an example of firefighter and doctor. Okay, and
Can you
is
explain that to me?
real quick. Epistemology is about knowledge. Okay. And so when we're talking about morality, I'm using a framework. And so you said, tell me that something is good that you ought not do. And I said, a doctor or a firefighter, give your life, donate all of your money. And so that was not an epistemic ought, that was a moral ought. And so this contradicts your view because
Wait, so I asked you for an example that is morally good, but shouldn't occur in then firefighters and doctors. I don't see how that pertains. Maybe you could explain to me.
Okay,
But
I mean, I can explain
for
it, so-
instance, in the case of the
can
firefighter and
explain it.
doctor, you might have compelling reasons, but what you should do is what you have the most reason to do, right? So like for instance, when you granted me the idea of unaliving one person or unaliving 5 people, we'd say you should unalive the one person
Yeah.
because you have the most reason to unalive the one person because in doing so, you're saving 4 other lives, right? So like for instance, I'll give you an example of this. When I get a vaccine, there's a little bit of pain, thank you for the galaxy, of the needle entering into my arm, right? But we'd say that I should experience that pain because all things considered, that is going to yield me the great benefit of being vaccinated to COVID or something along those lines, right? And then I just simply ask you, would it be bad for God to take away our free will?
Real quick, I'm not gonna, we're going to keep going on this.
Can I demonstrate it to you?
in order for me to go down this line, we need to finish this debate about what good is. And so, yes, I think in that case, you ought to do it and it is good, but that's a non sequitur. It doesn't logically follow that you ought to do all good things.
No, that's not the claim that I'm making.
That's literally what you define good as, or what oughtness was.
So something is good if like you should do it, something is bad if you shouldn't do it, but you also have things that are merely permissible that would be amoral in a sense.
Okay,
But like that's just like not relevant to the problem of evil.
that's going against your claim. What is it? I'm interacting.
What are the other three options?
You haven't given an argument that's not a non sequitur.
Thank you so much for the Rose
oughtness is
Nebula.
good.
Dean, let's let him speak real quick.
What is that, bro? Yeah, so I don't think open chat accident. I don't think you've given an argument that's not a non sequitur and why you should define good that way.
Wait, I'm so sorry. I'll just simply ask you. So yeah, we're talking about axiology here. Like essentially, like the implicit statement that you're making is I'm imposing my values onto you, right? So I'll just simply ask you here. When we're talking about morality, something is either obligatory, merely permissible. Thank you, Rachel. Let that go through. Or impermissible. Are there any other options when we're talking about good in a normative notion?
No, but I'm not sure how that's relevant to your claim.
Wait, okay, answer my question and I'll explain its relevance.
You're equivocating deontology and axiology. I don't know why we should identify it.
I'm asking you a question. If we're talking about good in a normative notion, something is either obligatory, merely permissible, or impermissible.
Okay.
You agree to that, right? So, and something is obligatory if it's something that you should do. Do you agree to that?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay, and something is merely permissible if you can do it. It's not necessarily the case that you should or shouldn't, correct?
Okay.
And something is impermissible